I wish we all got an Easter like the one Mary Magdalene got, at least as the Gospel of John reports it. Mary Magdalene stood outside the tomb weeping. She bent over to look into the tomb and saw angels. Then Mary stood up and turned around and saw Jesus risen from the dead, who called her by name. Yeah, I wish we all got an Easter like the one Mary Magdalene got. This year we get more of a Markan Easter. I think that's what most people get every year, an Easter the way Mark tells the story. Perhaps that's why Mark's Easter story is my favorite Easter story. And the women went out and fled from the tomb, Mark tells us, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So what were the women afraid of? What were the women terrified and amazed by? If the message of Easter, if the message of resurrection is nothing more than once you're dead, then you're not, death turns into new life, then what do we have to be afraid of? What do the women have to be terrified and amazed by? And yet, Mark tells us that they are. By the end of Mark's Easter story, the women and everyone else is afraid. All of Jesus' disciples have abandoned him. The women are filled with fear. And no one is willing to proclaim the good news, Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed. I guess it's hard to proclaim the good news if you really don't understand what the good news is. What is resurrection? New Testament scholar Dawn Atelde Wilhelm tells us that Mark doesn't really empower us to proclaim good news. Mark doesn't really bring closure to the gospel story. Instead, the Gospel of Mark opens the door of the tomb wide and beckons us to take a look inside. And then to go and to tell what we have heard and seen of our risen Lord. Hopefully, by the power of the Holy Spirit, Jesus is already out in front of us, leading the way. So what do we see as we look into the tomb? Jesus is risen. Death is no more. What is there to be terrified and amazed by? And yet, the angels tell the women what they are to say, and still they flee from the tomb and say nothing to anyone because they're afraid. What if the good news of Easter is more than when we die, we will rise? What if the good news of Easter is that Jesus is raised from the dead? God raised Jesus from the dead. I mean, of all the people that God could raise, why Jesus? What if Jesus' life is a reflection or even a model of the resurrection, of what resurrection life will be like? When you think about that, the Jesus life might be a model or a reflection of resurrection life. That's pretty scary. I mean, what was Jesus' life like? First of all, Jesus healed the sick. Jesus healed the sick. Especially today, that's really good news. Unless you're one of those that still believes that people get what they deserve, then Jesus healing everybody who's sick is problematic and scary. Jesus heals the sick on the Sabbath. On the Sabbath. We all know what we're supposed to be doing on the Sabbath. We're supposed to be going to church. Or we're supposed to be at our computers watching church. Is Jesus saying that you can not go to church and that God will still love you? You can not go to church and God will still heal you? Tell your congregational treasurer that, and that'll be scary stuff. Jesus forgives sins. Everyone? Everything? Don't you have to be sorry before Jesus will forgive you? How sorry do you have to be? Shouldn't we put precautions and protections, conditions, instructions on our forgiveness? I mean, Jesus just can't go around forgiving everyone for everything. Can he? Jesus eats with outcasts and sinners. That's scary stuff. You see, you can't share a meal with someone and get up from the table the same. Something happens. That's why when people date, they go out for dinner. Jesus eats with outcasts and sinners. Jesus redefines family. Jesus says that some things are thicker than blood. Jesus might even be uncomfortable with the church calling itself a family. And Jesus ignores tradition when tradition gets in the way of good news. He lets the disciples eat with their hands defiled. Now, I'm a liturgical scholar. I've spent my whole life studying traditions. If Jesus is just going to throw them out, to me, that's scary stuff. Jesus feeds people. Jesus feeds 5,000 people with 2 loaves and 5 fish. Jesus' perspective is abundance rather than scarcity. And Jesus seems to say that we have enough for everyone to get with what they need. I'm not sure that I'm comfortable with resurrection having an economic dimension, because then Jesus gets a say in what I do with my money. And if you don't get that, Jesus sends his disciples out with no purse, no bag, no money in their belts. I confess that these days I'm a little worried about money. It's right there after health. I worry about retirement. I worry about health care. I worry about paying my bills. If I allow myself to think about it, I am really dependent upon God and others. just like disciples sent with no bread, no bag, no money in their belts. That's kind of scary. Jesus says that to be number one, you need to be the least of all and the servant of all. And when you get all puffed up about your righteousness because you don't kill, lie, or steal, Jesus invites us to sell all that we have, to give our money to the poor, and to come follow him when we want to stand on our own righteousness. And Jesus says that his way is the way of the cross. It's the way of betrayal, denial, rejection, suffering, and death. And only then resurrection. There's no avoiding death, no denying death, no sidestepping death, no shortcutting death. That's scary for us who are afraid of death, especially these days. And that's scary for a church that too often thinks its mission is survival, and too often bears witness to the truth that it is afraid to die. Now, I could go on all day and talk about how the life of Jesus as a model of resurrected life is scary stuff. But we want to go look for Easter eggs. Besides, I think you get the point. They tell us that when this pandemic is over and we go back outside, life is going to be different. What if the difference is that life is going to be more like the life of Jesus? That's exciting to think about. It's also pretty scary because things are going to change and someone might get hurt. So rather than proclaim Christ is risen, maybe we do well to keep silence. After all, maybe those women who were brave enough to go to the tomb when the disciples remained in their beds were also wise enough to know that Jesus had more in mind than saying, once you're dead, then you're not. Jesus was talking about everything being different. And so the women went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Except for one thing. Somewhere, somehow, someone made those women speak. First in whispers to each other, but then to the rest of Jesus' disciples, and then out on the streets and in the world. Someone made those women speak. Christ is risen, risen indeed. And those who heard it tried to live more like Jesus. Oh yeah. Somewhere along the line, someone said it to you. Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed. But more importantly, someone lived resurrection, lived a bit more like Jesus in your life. And that made all the difference. And so you are here. Somewhere, somehow, someone made us speak. That one is here. Jesus Christ, risen indeed. And Jesus will not come into the tombs of our house or the tombs of our hearts and curl up and go to sleep. You see, the basic business of Jesus in our lives and in the world is to transform death into new life. So Jesus is going to blow the door of our tombs out from the inside and send us forth bursting with new life. If that seems a little bit scary, if that moves you to silence, that's okay. Take some time and ponder. What does it mean, resurrection? But know this. Somehow, somewhere, someone will move you to speak and to live a bit more like Jesus. That one is Jesus, risen indeed. He will move you to speak, and that will make all the difference. Christ is risen. Happy Easter.